Everyone. Hi, my name is Cecilia Kushner. I work at the Economic Development Corporation. It's a pleasure to be with you and to moderate this great panel to talk about the state of the real estate market in New York City and in the region. Just 2 words about who I am and who we are. So the Economic Development Corporation works on behalf of the city to push the economy of New York City forward. So we look at everything from incentive to industry partnership to large-scale transformation throughout the 5 boroughs. And so my team is leading some of the most complex projects that the administration is shepherding forward. For example, you may have heard of the Sunnyside Yard Master Plan, or the Roman Coastal Resiliency Project, or the Bronx Point First Hip-Hop Museum and Affordable Housing Project in the South Bronx. So we do kind of very large-scale planning, and so we really stay in touch with kind of how the market is operating and how the industry is responding to the city's investment. So we have a great panel today. I just would like first the panelists to just quickly introduce themselves before I begin to ask them questions.
Okay, should I go first? Hi everybody, my name's Ryan Schleiss. Thanks Cecilia and thanks AREAA for putting on this great event. I am Senior Vice President of Research and Analytics for the Corcoran Group, Corcoran Sunshine, and City Habitats. So my job is to study everything that's happening in the residential real estate market and help apply that information for our brokers and real estate agents as well as our developer clients. So analyzing market trends, analyzing what's happening in pricing, where development is happening and where it might be happening in the future.
Hello, my name is Eric Benaim. I'm the founder and CEO of Modern Spaces. We're a Western Queens-based, Long Island City-based real estate brokerage and marketing firm. We have about a 70% market share in Long Island City. Currently, we're overseeing about $4 billion in projects. We have been around for about 11 years now. We also have an investment sales division, and excited to be here. Thank you.
Afternoon, I'm James Rouse. I'm the Planning and Development Director for Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr., who's the County Executive in the Great Borough of the Bronx. We oversee all aspects of development and planning in the borough, land use and such, where we've personally invested over $250 million into various capital projects throughout about 10 years in office. I used to be the Capital Programs Director before the Planning Director, so I can speak to both the capital side and the development side. Thank you for having me.
Hi, I'm Seth Pinsky. I'm an Executive Vice President at RXR Realty. RXR is an integrated owner, operator, manager, developer of real estate with a focus on the New York region. We have about 25 million square feet of commercial space, most of that in New York City, but also on Long Island. We also have about 6,000 units in various stages of residential development. My focus has been on what we refer to as our emerging submarket strategy, which looks for areas around the region where there's been historic underinvestment, but where we think that there's good underlying fundamentals and the opportunity to partner with local governments in order to bring private capital and hopefully improve the lot of the people who live in the neighborhoods. Right now we're a master developer in a number of communities in the suburbs, including in New Rochelle, in Westchester, in Glen Cove, on Long Island, and also around the Nassau Coliseum. We also have development projects in several locations in Brooklyn and are looking in the other boroughs.
Great, thank you all. So just to get us started, I guess the general question, what is the one thing that you're working on right now that you're hearing is happening in the market that is the most exciting to you or the most interesting and novel?
I guess I'm going first.
Whoever wants to take it first.
I think there's so many really interesting projects right now happening in the marketplace. I think what's important is to dispel some of the notions about how some people feel that the market here has fundamentally changed and is fundamentally terrible, which is absolutely not the case. So one of the most exciting projects I'm doing is called 11 Hoyt Street. It's a project that I've been working on since before the developer acquired the site from Macy's. It's the old Macy's garage off Fulton Street in downtown Brooklyn. And there, we have worked hand in hand with the developer from the start to really figure out how to plan a building that's going to meet the needs of the market currently and as it's changing. And it's been the most successful project in Brooklyn since its launch as a result. So we've done over 120 deals there just in the past year. So that's been a great success and a great exciting thing to be part of in the face of some certain challenges in the marketplace, to realize that the process and the formula and working with a great client who is responding to those market changes, we can still transact and have a really successful project today.
Well, our core market is Long Island City. It's one of the most probably exciting markets in all of New York. I feel it's been like that for the last couple of years. I think our most exciting project right now is Skyline Tower, which is the tallest residential building, or actually tallest building outside of Manhattan. It just topped out about 2 weeks ago. It's an 802-unit condo project, the second largest by unit count in all of New York City. And it's probably the fastest or best-selling building in New York right now. We launched sales in May 1. And we're a little over 220 sales so far. We're also achieving about $200 higher per square foot than the rest of the market in our neighborhood. We're in the 1500s a foot right now. So that's really a huge, for us, it's like a historic project to be part of. Very exciting. And then we have a bunch of projects in the pipeline. We have about maybe like 6,000 units in the pipeline right now. Not just in Long Island City, we also have about 1,000 units in Woodside. We have about another 1,000 or so in Astoria, and we're in other markets as well, like Flushing. We have a project in Flushing right now called the Farrington, 101-unit condo project. And we have various projects throughout various phases right now. All of them exciting in their own right.
It's almost unfair to ask what single project
That's right, I had to make-
in the Bronx. So, but I'm gonna, the Bronx right now, as many of you know, is, the hottest market county in the state, and we're very proud of that. We've come a long way, over the last 30, 40 years. So, if I had to narrow it down without narrowing it down, it's really everything happening below 161st Street right now, and the various dynamics that are changing. Market rate is no longer a bad word in the Bronx, and so we're trying to figure out a way to balance all of that. Everything from the 161st Street rezoning near Yankee Stadium years ago, the lower concourse rezoning between 138th and 149th Street, which is really where a lot of the opportunity is taking place and a lot of people are focusing on, but also Mont Haven and Port Morris, where there has been a natural evolution, not really spawned by rezoning, but just because of its proximity to Manhattan and the Third Avenue Bridge, just over the Harlem River. So we're seeing a mixed transformation where two 25-story towers just topped out just below the Major Deegan Expressway in Port Morris, but at the same time, as Cecilia mentioned, Bronx Point, which is going to be over 1,000 units of affordable housing, covering the gambit, 30 to 130% of AMI. It also housed the world's first hip-hop museum and complete a waterfront park that was built about 10 years ago as part of the Yankee Stadium deal. So there's a lot just covering, both market rate and affordable there, and we're really excited about what's going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years in that space.
So I guess I'll pick two projects, which I think are interesting, both because they're interesting, but also because the collaboration that was involved in order to unlock the opportunities. So the first is actually in the suburbs in downtown New Rochelle, which I mentioned, we're the master developer in that community. New Rochelle is a community that had literally been, not literally, it had figuratively been torn apart by a development project in the early part of the 2000s that eventually was defeated. People weren't talking to one another in the community. People and elected officials weren't talking to one another. And so the city realized that it needed to change the way that it approached development. So they issued an RFP looking for a master developer. We responded and were ultimately selected, and then worked collaboratively with the city and with the community to come up with a downtown redevelopment plan. The important part, I think, of how we got to where we are was that rather than coming into the community and saying, this is what we want, take it or leave it, we first spent several months just listening to people on the ground. We went to church basements, to people's living rooms, to community centers, and just asked open-ended questions to have a sense as to what people's fears were, what their desires were, and based on that then put together a plan, which of course also had to work financially from our perspective. We were able then to get through the approvals in a very short period of time unanimously, again in a political environment where people hadn't been talking to one another previously, and ultimately entitled about 11 million square feet of development in the downtown, which is essentially like putting the World Trade Center into the middle of New Rochelle. We as the master developer control about 30% of that, so 3 to 4 million square feet. We recently completed our first residential development, which is a 28-story building, which has a 10,000 square foot black box theater at the base, which was something that was built into the zoning, an incentive for developers to create community amenities in the project. And we actually just last week broke ground on a 2-tower, 700-unit rental building that will have some public open space, again taking advantage of these zoning incentives. The good news is that our development has actually spurred a significant amount of development in the downtown around there. And because the redevelopment project was developed in conjunction with a private developer, the market has responded very positively to it, because while it certainly protects the interests of the community, it also doesn't protect those interests to such an extent that it makes development financially impossible. So that's one project. And then a second, which I'll just describe much more briefly, is a project that we're working on right now in downtown Brooklyn, where we're partnered with Long Island University. Long Island University has a fairly sizable campus right in the heart of downtown Brooklyn. For a long time, it was a liability for the university because the neighborhood was a challenged neighborhood. But over the last several years, as the neighborhood has become much more attractive, the university realized that they had an asset. They approached several developers and had initial agreements with those developers to bring private investment to the campus so that they could invest in their academic facilities and build their endowment. And in each instance, those agreements fell apart. And what we learned subsequently was that the reason for that was, again, you had developers coming to the table who said basically, this is what I want, and if you don't want this, I'm not interested. And so again, like we did in New Rochelle, we spent time with the university, really tried to understand what their needs were, and we recently broke ground on a 30-plus story rental building that we're building on the campus that unlocks value that they had that they otherwise weren't able to unlock. We're building new campus facilities, academic facilities for them, and we also wrote them a sizable check which they can use to invest in their student programs. And we're looking at working with them and hopefully the City of New York on a rezoning to allow us to unlock more value on the campus and carry this model forward.
Great, thank you. So how has 2019 played out so far, and what are you optimistic and pessimistic about the future of the residential market in New York City?
2019 has certainly been a more challenging year than the previous ones in the market, but so we've seen, for example, speaking to the Brooklyn market, we have unfortunately seen fewer transactions happening on the sales side, down about 8% so far this year. Inventory has grown a bit, but the inventory situation, the supply situation for new development in particular in Brooklyn is not anywhere near what we're seeing in Manhattan. So the relative relationship between supply and demand in Brooklyn is still really strong. So that's keeping the market solid and allowing a lot of projects to continue to do quite well, as I mentioned earlier. So we're seeing prices start to come down just a little bit. And I think that that's good for a lot of buyers, maybe not as good for some developers, but it's good for some people. And there's certainly more negotiability in the marketplace. And, in certain sites, as I said, are responding more to those changes. So the challenges in the market, I think, are surmountable. I think that there's tactics to get through them if certain folks sort of attach and know what they're doing to get through those challenges. So I'm still very optimistic about the future of the Brooklyn market. There's still a lot of potential for that market to grow, to continue, to change, to see value grow, to see neighborhoods improve. So I still have a lot of belief that in the long term that market has a lot of runway yet to really change and to really appreciate.
We started off the year thinking Amazon was coming, so it was very exciting. Unfortunately, that didn't really happen. But I think even after Amazon left on February 14th, we weren't sure what was going to happen. But a lot of our projects, surprisingly, started selling. We actually saw a 16% increase the week after February 14th of traffic and transactions than it was the prior week. And originally when Amazon had come literally a year next week, our traffic had jumped 400% from the prior week. So it was still way up than what it was a year before. What it did was, I think, was just opened up everyone's eyes into Long Island City. I think a lot more people are more aware of the neighborhood now. Probably a lot of people the last few weeks of late few weeks of January and beginning of February, people were probably thinking they weren't able to get an apartment because there was just so many people coming to our open houses or sales offices or whatever. And I think the traffic, we started getting more real buyers, less investors. We're seeing probably a lot less investors now than we did the year before. That said, we launched a project on May, and since that, we've sold about 220 units. That's, I think, a real success for us. I am very optimistic for the future of Long Island City. We released, we track the market, much like you guys do, and we just released our recent report, I think, a couple weeks ago, and we became the first neighborhood in Queens to have an average price point of $1 million. So we broke that, I guess, Sense record for Queens. And with regards to rentals, the rent regulation law that unfortunately, in my opinion, passed June 14th, ended up seeing an increase in traffic for rents as well as prices in our rental projects. I think 2020, we're going to see a lot more people looking for deals. We did see a lot more inventory this year than we have in the history of Long Island City. In prior years, we were probably selling, like last year, for example, 258 units were sold in Long Island City. This year, so far, it's about 440, and the year's not even over yet. So I am optimistic in that sense. I do think now we're seeing a lot more people taking their time. And we are actually seeing people crossing to Brooklyn, crossing to Manhattan, and not just coming to Long Island City thinking about Long Island City, but they're looking everywhere. We just had somebody going back and forth. One of our projects, we went to a project by Hudson Yards the other day. So that's a good thing for me, I think, where we're an option, whereas people who are looking at Manhattan probably wouldn't really think about us.
I think I touched upon my last statement. It's, the Bronx has been getting a lot of play, we get a lot of questions from folks that we've never heard of before, like what's happening in the Bronx. So I think that's part of the positive, is that there's new opportunities for development, that more and more people are interested in it. And so they're new players, and we're really beginning to top out and come to a head with a lot of projects that we've been working on for a while now, ranging from, specifically in housing, La Central, which is in the hub area of the Bronx of 149th and 3rd Avenue. It's a 992-unit affordable housing development. I'm not sure if folks have heard Project Via Verde, which was a design competition with AREAA and HPD to show that affordable housing can be also high design in the mix of low income and home ownership. This is La Central is catty-corner to that project, and it's going to be LEED Platinum. It's going to have one of 2 new YMCAs in the Bronx. It's going to have an annex for BronxNet Studios, which is our public access TV, and 40 to 50,000 square feet of retail, as well as publicly accessible open space. And the hub was the Bronx's first central business district. Like with many inner city areas during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it fell on hard times, but was always very active and vibrant. But there were pockets of empty spaces, warehoused upper floors, and so projects like this are really going to catalyze places like the Hub and regain or add to the vibrancy that's already there. I'd have to say, in terms of concerns that we have for 2019, is because we're such a hot market. We've been a hot market for a while, but solely for affordable housing. But in general, one thing folks should know is the Bronx has the lowest home ownership rate of any county in New York State, and the second most of any county in the entire country. And just with the rate of development happening, the Bronx is not really seen as a home ownership market. So we're going to be releasing a report soon on leftover 1 to 4 family homes in higher density districts, because those are being bought up rapidly and being replaced by rental units. And so while there's a desperate need for affordable rental units and just rental units in general, we're currently just above 18% in terms of our home ownership rate. And so that's far below the city and way, way, way below the rest of the country. And it's decreasing because that home ownership stock is not being replaced with co-ops or condos. And we're in the Bronx, we're hearing, oh, there's such a condo glut in the city, and it's just like, not us. We're not experiencing it. It's just like, actually, if anything, we're losing home ownership. So it's really understanding what the neighborhoods are and what they want and need. And so that's kind of like what we're kind of excited about, but also a little wary about, is that we're just going to be a destination for one type of housing.
I guess in terms of what I'm optimistic about, echoing some of what you've heard from the other panelists, I think that if you look at New York over the last 20 years or so, we've been blessed by a largely uninterrupted virtuous cycle where New York, because the quality of life has improved dramatically, or had improved dramatically from where it was in the 70s and 80s and early 90s, became a magnet for talent. And that talent in turn has attracted businesses. And the businesses in turn attract more talent, and the cycle continues. And if you look at the number of jobs that currently exist in New York, we're at record levels. And for many, many years, we kept approaching 4 million jobs in New York City, and then every time we'd get close to it, there'd be a recession and we'd fall back. And we were never able to breach that level, and now we're, I think, well above 4 million jobs. And not just that we're attracting a large number of jobs, but we're attracting some of the most highly sought after companies and some of the most highly sought after industries. And something that I think is working to New York's advantage in that respect is that in the technology field, in the last 10 or 15 years, the technology field went from being focused on solely producing new gadgets to the application of those gadgets. And when application became a key focus of these companies, coming to a place where there's expertise in various different economic sectors was critical to their success. And of course, there's nowhere in the country, maybe nowhere in the world, that has more of that expertise than New York. And so that's another advantage that we have had, that we continue to have. And in addition to that, what we're also seeing in the last few years is that traditional markets like the Bay Area and Boston, essentially those markets are tapped out. The talent is all deployed, and it's very hard for these very fast-growing companies to find new talent in those areas. And so because of just New York's scale, many of them are finding that they have to invest here. So that's all good news. And I would add on top of that, then another piece of good news, as I mentioned in my description of New Rochelle, which we're seeing elsewhere, I think outside of New York City, there are some real opportunities for investment around transit hubs. In New York City, there's been a long tradition of finding underdeveloped transit nodes like subway stops and bringing new investment to those areas and having people follow. And we've seen that all over the outer boroughs. We're seeing that now in the Bronx, which is great. That trend largely passed the suburbs by, especially along the commuter rail lines. But for a variety of reasons, the politics which had prevented that from happening in the past is now turning in favor of development, because the suburbs are while the city is thriving, the suburbs have actually encountered real issues. And so people are realizing that if they want to attract young people, they want to attract the workforce of tomorrow, they have to build the kinds of downtowns that those populations are looking for. And so there's an openness where previously there hadn't been. I guess in terms of concerns, I would say a few things. One is that with all of the success that we've had as a region, we haven't been so great at having our supply keep pace with demand. And that's impacting us in a number of different ways. Our infrastructure, as everyone is well aware, is really stretched thin at this point, and we're not investing enough to accommodate the growth that's been happening, let alone the growth that hopefully will be coming. That also has manifested itself in an affordability crisis, as housing in particular has not kept pace with supply, with demand. And that's potentially problematic for a region that relies on talent, and something that all of us need to pay close attention to. Another thing I would say that's a little bit concerning is that the whole I guess the flame that lit the fire that has now driven the engine were improvements in quality of life. And by many measures, quality of life in New York City is still excellent, and it certainly is miles beyond where it was 20 or 25 years ago. But there are some signs that crime may be ticking up. Just anecdotally, the city doesn't seem as clean as it once was. There's lots of vacant retail. And those sorts of things are things that could potentially reverse that virtuous cycle, and I think need to be paid attention to. And then the last thing that I would just say is I think that something that we all need to pay attention to is just politics. And for a whole variety of reasons, there's been a dramatic shift in the political discourse from, if not pro-development, at least not anti-development, to a point now where the dominant narrative is one of being opposed to development. And in fairness to a lot of people who do oppose development, I think that development has imposed a lot of burdens on a lot of people, and that not everyone has benefited from the development that's taken place here. I also think that our industry, the real estate industry, maybe in some cases won too many times, and has in some ways invited some of the criticism that it's received. But in the long run, if the city is going to thrive, and if we're going to continue to grow, we have to increase supply to match that growth. And if the political class puts more and more obstacles in the way of growth, eventually the whole thing could turn around. And I'm not certainly saying that we're at that point, but I think it's something that we need to pay very close attention to.
So I'm sorry. I just wanted to speak, echo what Seth, I sat on at least a half a dozen panels with Seth. He's probably the smartest guy I know. I think it's very important that everybody get involved with politics and vote during the primaries. The primaries is probably extremely important for everybody to get involved with, because what Seth was saying, the business class or the real estate class or everybody, we're losing, and the city is getting hurt because the people who are opposed to us are defeating us during the primaries. And to do that, you actually, whatever party you're affiliated with, you need to be a registered Democrat in the city. So whatever if you're an independent, it's about 700,000 registered independents in New York City. I would probably affiliate yourself as a Democrat just so you can vote in the primaries.
We certainly don't want to turn into, from a housing supply perspective, what's happening in the Bay Area, right? Where, and thankfully, we have produced enough housing over the last 15 plus years where we're not in the dire situation that they're seeing in certain parts of California. But I agree with Seth, there are some cracks in what's happening here that could push us in that direction. And in the outer boroughs in particular, and the suburbs are really the main release valve for where we can supply the housing that is needed to keep the city running. The growth in the tech industry has been a key part, especially since the Great Recession, to drive what's been happening in the city lately and take the place of some of the employment that's happened.
Long time. When people try to make changes that are reasonable changes to things like rent regulation, and year after year they're blocked entirely and there's no compromise. An unfortunate but a not unexpected reaction is that eventually when something does change, it changes dramatically. And I think that with respect to rent regulation, where we ended up was a combination of changes that probably should have been made a long time ago and that the real estate industry should have said yes to a long time ago, and a bunch of changes that are going to be extremely harmful to the very people that the rent regulations are supposed to help. The other thing that I find a little bit discouraging in the conversation in Albany last session, where rent regulation was such a focus and therefore affordability was such a focus, is that in talking about affordability, the only discussion was about rent regulation, when at the end of the day, the fundamental problem that we face here is not that we don't have enough rent-regulated units, it's that we don't have enough units. We have a supply and demand imbalance. And if you're increasing regulations on existing units and then making it harder for people to create new units, you're not only not going to solve the problem, you're going to make the problem worse. And we as an industry, I think, need to figure out how to explain that to people, but we also have to do it in a way where maybe we don't win every time, and where maybe we as an industry win a little less, still have viable projects, because you have to have viable projects, they have to be financeable, but maybe where the cushion above viability is not as fat as it's been for a number of years, because in the long run, I think giving on those sorts of things is an investment in the future, and that's how you keep things more reasonable and in the middle of the political spectrum, rather than forcing them to swing to one extreme or the other.
So that's a good segue. How is this conversation happening in the industry, and is the industry beginning to think differently about different types of projects, different types of processes to lend residential projects? What the future should look like in order to be able to politically be successful in lending projects and continue kind of like the amazing growth that New York City has seen? Or is everyone still in a state of shock and kind of not able to yet think about a positive future and how to get there?
I'll respond. I think that after the last legislative session in Albany, people now understand that something fundamentally has changed. And I think there is a realization that the old way of doing business won't work, at least for the foreseeable future, and that it's necessary for the industry to change its approach. Whether that's sunk in to the extent that will be necessary for real change to occur or not is a question that I have in my mind. I think a lot of people are saying the right things, but what I'm finding is in discussions with real estate people, when you say, okay, so we need to change something, how about this? All the people who are affected by this say, well, not that thing. And then you say, well, what about this? And they say, well, not that thing. And at some point, again, compromise is about giving a little to get a little, and the industry is going to have to give a little. And I haven't yet seen, broadly speaking, a willingness to make real gives yet. But I'm hopeful that as we go into the next legislative session, I think see the next round of potentially challenging legislation coming forward, that will sink in further, and that the industry will be ready to match its words, which, and I don't want to minimize that, that's a big step, but its words with real action.
I think the issue with that though is that the other side is not willing to compromise. That's the issue we have, and we saw that with Amazon, where they wouldn't even come to the table. Amazon wanted to talk and say, what can we do? We want to stay here, and they just didn't want to take any meetings, and they were just no, no, no. So when both sides are willing to compromise, I think the real estate or the business side is willing because they understand business and they're looking for progress, real progress. The other side, they're just stubborn and it's their way or the highway.
I would frame that a little differently, though, because it's not an either or. It's, I think that's one side. I think there are multiple sides there, and I think, you know, it's the dialogue I feel like this country's in right now. It's A or B, but there's a whole bunch of people and different, not just one group of people, multiple groups of people in the middle that just don't have as loud of a voice, because that's, you know, it's not the, you know, soundbite. And, you know, after, you know, I was saying a little earlier, dealing with an issue yesterday where a tour in the Bronx had to be canceled because a community group sent an email just saying, we're coming after you if you walk through our neighborhood. You know, it's kind
That's
of
pretty normal.
yeah. I wouldn't, it may happen. I wouldn't say it's normal, but there's a lot of folks willing to talk and discuss out there. You know, just getting back to you know, Bronx Point again, is that, you know, an affordable housing community on one side of the coin, you know, LMM and Ron Molis is the boogeyman. You know, he's, you know, getting all these projects, he's storming into our neighborhoods, but to their credit, they've been having regular community meetings with the community board, with stakeholders, and with community residents. And so there are people out there attending these meetings who are technically the other side of the coin that aren't, you know, willing to burn everything down. The one thing I have noticed, and maybe it's just specifically in the Bronx, is that, you know, in the Bronx we feel like we've seen what's happened elsewhere, and so we feel a little more prepared in terms of our narrative, in terms of like being able to speak up. You know, we see what we don't want to happen, but we have a sense of what we want to happen. But what surprised us in the industry is that folks that we've read about, heard about, are, you know, making their way into the Bronx, and they're just saying, hey, so I'm going to do this huge project. It's going to be like 400 or 500 units. It's just, I'm curious, how do I do affordable housing as this part of this project? And we're like, what, you're coming to us? Because 4 or 5 years ago, when people were looking at Mott Haven and Port Morris in particular, saying, oh, we're looking at this, but we're not sure about it, because if I can't get at least $3,500 for a studio, it's not worth my effort. And we're like, bye, because you're not going to get $3,500 for a studio, at least not now. And so other folks are coming in saying, okay, you know, I'm willing to do 30% affordable. And it's like, okay, like what programs are you going to go to? He goes, no, I'll go into an agreement with the city. Like, I'll just do it myself. I don't even want to go through the process of going through the city. And we're just like, really? And so it's raising an eyebrow for us in a good way. It's that we feel that, and what we were talking about before, and we're hoping that this is a trend, that the industry is paying attention and that it's listening, because just the fact that we've had 5 or 6 developers come in the last few months just saying, hey, how can we make part of this project affordable, is not something we've heard before from the market side. It's like, usually it's why do I have to do any affordable, and how can you change that for me? And so it's been a better conversation.
And also, if I can just push back a little bit on what Eric was saying, I do think that Amazon was a particularly bad example, and I think that the opposition to Amazon was not interested in facts, and just as you said, the fact that they wouldn't even talk to Amazon was really shameful, and it resulted in a huge missed opportunity for the city, and I think painted a group of people and exposed them to be truly unreasonable. So I agree with that, but I don't think that that's generally the rule. I think that's the exception, and I feel like over the years, both in private work and also working in government, there have been very few examples that I've seen where if you actually take the time to sit down and talk to people and listen to people, where you can't figure out a path forward. And that may involve making real compromises, it may involve everyone being a little bit unhappy with what you end up with. But in my experience, in most communities that I've been involved in, it's that investment of time and effort and building relationships that's the key to actually getting past all of the yelling and screaming that we see. And certainly not everyone is going to be happy at the end of the process, but you can get enough people happy that you can actually get through the political piece of it, and then you can move forward with projects. And I still believe that even in the world that we're in now, which is crazy and where people generally are not willing to talk to one another.
Great. So last question to try to end on a positive note. Are there any projects that the city, the states, the region, the federal government is working on, around New York City or in the region that you think are interesting and are going to drive the market in the long run?
I think that that's a really important thing to pay attention to and to track, and that's something that I always talk to potential real estate investors or buyers about, really making sure you understand. If you look historically, that is what has driven a lot of the parts of New York that have been the places where people have done the best. And one of my other sort of aphorisms is buy on the border. So kind of find that area that gives you that option to go two different ways, that gives you, that you feel like is an area that is transitioning. And so one that comes to mind that fits what you're talking about is what is going to be happening in Gowanus. I think is really interesting. Hopefully happens in a way that sort of benefits all sides of the coin, from who might be currently living there or currently own there, and who might be moving to that area. But it's just a natural place where we can build in this city and not displace people. It's a largely industrial zone, so I think and it's right bordered by two wonderful parts of town. So I think that that's one area in Brooklyn, for example, that is one to watch.
I think there's been a lot of talk recently about what's going to happen with the campus site and the waterfront site of where Amazon was supposed to be. So a lot of the stakeholders on those sites, it's about 28 acres in total, started meeting together and meeting with the city, meeting with local organizations, meeting with just the community, trying to take what people are looking for, having a nice mixed-use district. It's kind of like what they're talking about now. So I'm kind of very hopeful to see what happens over there.
Yeah, aside from the lower concourse, the areas below 161st Street I was talking about, where there's, that's going to be very transformative. The other area I would highlight is that 4 new Metro North stations are coming to the Bronx in Co-op City, Morris Park, Parkchester, Van Nest, and Hunts Point. There's not much you can do more in Co-op City because there's a lot of swampland over there. But the other areas, we've been working with various agencies at the city and state level to try to really create a vision for that. At Morris Park, you have the Hutch Metro Center, which is a huge office park with offices, hotels, residences, and right really next to one of our hospital hubs in the borough with Einstein, Jacobi, Calvary, and such. So we see that area just booming, even though it's next to a low-rise residential area. That particular intersection, Parkchester, Van Nest, the same way, the northern side of Parkchester, we really see along East Tremont Avenue taking off, and Hunts Point, our largest industrial center, the food distribution center. So right around that area, there's a small residential community, but a vibrant retail community as well. And so we really see those underutilized lots really being built up. So you really have development just happening throughout the borough. And so the investments that the state in particular has made into developing Metro North stations we see really transforming the borough in its entirety, not just one pocket.
And I think in addition to all of these initiatives and lots of great projects that the city and state are pursuing, I think probably the most important thing that's happening is our investment in infrastructure, the transportation and infrastructure in particular. I think congestion pricing is going to be a really meaningful change for Midtown or Manhattan south of 59th Street in ways that people haven't fully internalized yet, and that will also create substantial amounts of money that will allow finally major investments to be made in the subway again, which is critical to the future of everything here. And then I think the investments in the commuter rail lines are another transformative investment. The 4 stations in the Bronx are part of a larger project that's all unlocked by East Side Access, which is bringing Long Island Railroad into Grand Central, which also will be hugely transformative by then relieving some of the pressure at Penn Station that allows some Metro North lines to come into, or one Metro North line to come into Penn Station. So that's another important investment. And then the last thing I'd say is just repeating one thing I said earlier, which is I think this change in the politics of the suburbs and the ability now to start looking at rail hubs in the suburbs. There's huge untapped potential there. The RPA, the Regional Plan Association, estimated that if all of the transit hubs in the suburbs of New York City were developed just in a contextual way, so not building 80-story buildings, that you'd be able to create about 250,000 new housing units. And so that would go a long way towards providing us the supply that we need. And as I said, the politics are changing the way where that may now be possible.
Great, thanks. Maybe we have time for one question from the audience before we go to break and leave the room. Does anyone want to ask a question?
I want to ask Mr. Kushner, after the city kick out the Amazon, what kind of incentive from the city for the, let's say, 421A tax abatement for residential building or hub zone for commercial building? Thank you.
Sure. So I'll try to answer the best of my ability. So like when Amazon came, there were 2 sets of incentives. For the city, all the incentives were as of right, meaning any company today that creates jobs in Long Island City, in generally in the outer boroughs outside of Midtown Manhattan, receives as of right subsidies from the city. It's kind of like a policy that's a few decades long that's really meant to make sure that we have outer borough, regional, and citywide commercial hubs. So this policy continues, and it's a really important policy to make sure that places like downtown Brooklyn or Long Island City or even the South Bronx continue to attract, or the North Shore of Staten Island, for example, continue to attract a certain amount of jobs. Most of the subsidies that Amazon was meant to receive in coming to New York City came from the states, which has the ability to do a lot more discretionary subsidy. And my understanding is that that policy is not going to change from them as well. So from the city's perspective, we're still very much committed to do 2 things, continuing like the incredible job growth that we've had over the last few years, but also making sure that we diversify our economy. I think a large part of why New York City has the economy and the city has done well and in a very stable way over the last few years is because we've really invested in new industries. Like the tech industry was a huge, an industry that the city has invested in greatly over the last 10 years. Right now, we're at EDC doing a lot of work with the life science industry, which is extremely growing, like healthcare and life science, which is like the high-end research side of healthcare, shows some of the most promising jobs over the last 10 and 20 years. And right now, Boston is kind of the national center for life science, and in New York City, we want New York City over the next 10 years to become the epicenter of life science. We're doing a lot of work in cybersecurity, which is also a really important industry for the future that is going to create a lot of jobs. And for us, it's both growing the economy and making sure that we're supporting industries that offer jobs at every level. So in life science, in cybersecurity, and in tech, you can have people that just have a high school degree or a certification being able to make kind of like strong wages in New York and being able to afford living here, as well as having really high-end talent that's competitive with the rest of the nation and you know, like international cities with whom we compete as well. So this is kind of we're pushing forward. Great. Thank you. That concludes our